today. Hello. Welcome all. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce our speaker for LACEA plenary session, James Robinson, or Jim, as we know him. He's Reverend, let me see if I say it right, Reverend Dr. Richard Pearson, Professor of Global Conflict Studies and University Professor at the University of Chicago, and he has taught previously at Harvard, Berkeley, among other schools. So Jim is an extraordinarily prolific author, both in economics and political science. His political economy and economic history work doesn't need any introduction, with Daron Acemoglu, with Simon Johnson, and other co-authors, has been enormously influential. His path-breaking article in AER, that's a favorite, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development and Empirical Investigation, has over, last time I checked, 16,400 citations. That's counts for something. And his book with Daron, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, has over 14,000 citations. This is the sort of work that is not only influential and well-cited, I would say, the sort of work that many of us think deserves at some point a Nobel Prize. Besides being a great economist and political scientist, Jim is a true intellectual. He can discuss at ease about economic history, mathematical models, literature, art, anthropology. Jim has a talent that we appreciate very well in Latin America. He's a great conversationist. So on a personal note, I would say that in a small talk with Jim in different circumstances in Mexico or in the US, I have learned a lot and found inspiration for my own research. I feel every time I have talked to Jim, I have headed back home with a reading list. Last but most importantly, as well, Jim has a special place in his heart for our region, for Latin America. So without any further, Jim, bienvenido como siempre y estás en tu casa.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Cesar, for that extremely generous introduction. Oh, gosh. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. And I'm going to talk about I feel like I should be saying something big and profound in this room with all you people here, but instead I'm going to talk about something very nerdy, and we can discuss like how I clustered the standard errors and things like that. But this is a joint project with two of my collaborators at the University of the Andes in Bogota, Leopoldo Ferguson and Jose Alberto Guerra, and it's on antisocial norms. Okay, I gave some ridiculous title when Cesar maybe asked what I was going to talk about. So just to get you all interested, you know. So now I have to kind of damp down the expectations. So antisocial norms, what's that about? So let me give you a big introduction before I get stuck into the nitty-gritty of the research design, which is, you know, I've done a lot of work, which Cesar was referring to, about institutions and development, and a lot of it's been about Latin America, because when Daron and I and Simon Johnson got sort of interested in this topic, one of the proximate sources of that was the work by Stanley Engerman and Kenneth Sokolov. So Ken and Stan were interested very much in this comparative development within the Americas, and they developed this sort of institutional narrative, and that was very inspiring in the early days. And I think in that work, when we talk about institutions, there's always this distinction which Douglas North made between sort of formal and informal institutions. You know, think of formal, what James Madison would have talked about as like parchment institutions, things written on paper, the Constitution, laws. But then there's also informal institutions. So in Doug North's work, you know, he immediately sort of, when he's starting to talk about comparative development, he sort of says, well, obviously a moment's introspection will show that informal institutions, norms, practices are extremely important in determining incentives and opportunities and constraints. I think if you think about most of the empirical work, the work that Cesar was mentioning, we talk about institutions, but actually it's a sort of package. If you're going to talk about the security of property rights, I think every economist understands the sort of mechanisms linking security of property rights to investment and prosperity, but the security of property rights is a big package of things. It might be particular forms of property, how property is held. It might be judicial institutions. You know, it might be the role of the state in defining property rights and enforcing property rights. So it's really a bundle of informal and formal institutions. And I think that's true of most of this work. It's true of Melissa Dell's paper about the long-run impact of extractive institutions in Peru with the Potosí Mita. You know, that is really a bundle of things. I think I'm not going to talk about the literature I'm just going to have one slide positioning myself or positioning ourselves today. You know, maybe there's some more precise estimates of the impact of formal institutions, you know, thinking of the work by Ferraz and Feinan, looking at these anti-corruption drives. I say et sec, that means you wrote a lot of papers on that, Claudio. Thomas Fujiwara's paper on electoral, you know, on the secret kind of balloting, electronic balloting in Brazil, where you can get kind of leverage on one variation in formal institutions. And there's also work on informal institutions. You know, I think particularly, say, the paper by Feinan and Schechter about reciprocity, looking at the connection between reciprocity and vote buying in Paraguay. But even that, when you think about it, is a complicated mixture of formal and informal. So it might be true that the more reciprocal you are, which is what they find, the more likely it is somebody's going to buy your vote because it helps enforce the contract. But of course, that's synergetic with the nature of the state in Paraguay and the patrimonial nature of the state. So that in itself is really a kind of composition of formal and informal institutions. Okay? So I think, you know, where we're starting from is this sort of literature here and trying to think about how to study more systematically informal institutions and social norms in Latin America and try to start thinking about their consequences for development. Okay, so I'm going to do that in Colombia. Why? Well, if we're talking about Latin American underdevelopment, then at some level we're interested in dysfunctional norms, or, you know, what we say, antisocial norms. Okay, and I think the existence of such antisocial norms is extremely evident hanging out in Colombia. Okay, so this is the sort of inspiration for this project. Let me just give you some examples. I have 3 examples here. No sea sapo, which is going to be the focus of the research, which is don't be a toad. I can come to like literally. Tiene rabo de paja, you have a backside of grass, and no des papaya, don't give papaya. Okay, so let me illustrate these with particular anecdotes. So like start with, so the first thing I want to convince you is these things are everywhere in Colombian society, okay? This is not some exotic, weird thing. It's like highly prevalent in Colombian society in my personal experience. We have some data on that I'm going to show you. So no sea sapo, let me illustrate that. So last summer, my wife and I went to Armenia on holiday. So we flew from Bogota to Armenia. We get out to the airport, and there's like this row of taxi drivers. So we need to get a taxi to the hotel. And we're just about to approach the first taxi driver, and somebody else comes over and says, no, I take you. Where are you going? I take you. And the taxi drivers stand there, like, looking at us. And then we get across the road, we put the suitcase in the car, and then a policeman appears and says, no, this guy's not allowed to pick up passengers at the airport. So then we had to take everything out of the car. We go back across the road. We go to the first taxi driver in the queue. And my wife says to him, but you should have just told us that guy can't pick up here. And the guy says, what do you think I am, a sapo? So the notion of a sapo is someone who basically corrects bad behavior. Okay, you see somebody behaving badly, doing something wrong. If you complain about that, you're ratting them out. You're a sapo. Okay, don't be a sapo. Okay, he has a backside of grass. Let me give you an example of this. President Santos in Colombia introduced a rule whereby ministers had to report their assets. Ministers report their assets, to great hilarity of my Colombian collaborators. Everybody massively understates their assets, okay? So then the conversation goes, well, come on, this is not serious. Everyone understates their assets. Oh, you better shut up. You have rabo de paja. You've done things that are wrong too. If you start complaining, someone will come after you. So shut up. Okay, so rabo de paja. Everybody has something wrong. You've got, you know, your backside will be on fire before you know it if you open your mouth. Okay, and don't give papaya. No, there's papaya. What does giving papaya means? It means giving somebody the opportunity to take advantage of you. So if I give papaya to you, I'm giving you an opportunity to take advantage of me. Okay, and what comes after? Don't give papaya. If somebody gives you papaya, take it. Okay, so that's the 11th commandment, no? Okay, so I guess, you know, so this is a sort of, you know, some hilarity and stuff, but like, so the idea here is try to kind of study these norms in some detail in an experimental setting. I think it's very hard to imagine studying this in a kind of observational context, and try to study it in an experimental study and try to understand, you know, how does that affect behavior? And also, you know, very interesting, you know, where did it come from, right? So there's a lot of focus in the literature on extractive institutions, on Latin American development, in the kind of historical roots of these institutions. So I think it's just as interesting in the context of social norms to try to think about where that came from, where these things came from. And also, if it's so dysfunctional, how does something like that persist in equilibrium? Okay, so I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I think we've at least clarified, by the end of the talk, I'll at least clarified what the puzzle is in this case, I think. I don't know how to write a model of it down, but okay. So we're going to focus on LACEA sapo, which I sort of motivated as this, you know, you could think of it just mind your own business. It's not that, you know, every society has norms like this. I can show you some comparative data later. It's not that Colombia or whatever is the only place that has such a thing, but at least speaking as an English person, there are analogues in England, but they're much less prevalent in England, and the use of them, you know, is much less evident in English society. Okay, so why did we look at this? I think we could have looked at any of these particular norms, but we thought what was particularly interesting about LACEA sapo is how it relates to the kind of behavioral literature on norms. Okay, so particularly this work, Joe Henrich's work, the work of Fair and Fischbacher, and this notion that, of course, you know, prosociality is useful in equilibrium, and prosociality can often be enforced by third-party enforcement. Okay, so what Fair and Fischbacher showed is that introducing third-party punishment into a kind of dictator game improves prosociality. Okay, so outsiders have some notion of what people should do, and they are willing to pay costs to punish non-prosocial behavior. So what's interesting from the perspective of LACEA sapo is that it seems kind of almost designed to destroy this kind of third-party enforcement. Okay, so LACEA sapo is saying exactly third parties should not get involved. You should stay out of it. Okay, otherwise you're a sapo. Okay, so the first thing you might, you know, I told you some stories, but you might be interested in knowing, you know, how prevalent is this sapo in. I'm going to tell you more about the history of it when I've shown you some basic results. But we wanted to look at how prevalent is this. So if you just look at El Tiempo, the newspaper, you know, there's a digital archive. We can sort of map out 200 or so uses of sapo. So we just search for sapo, when does it come up in particular circumstances, and we dropped observations of biologists, like so sapo can be used in different contexts, but sort of narrowing attention to the kind of context we're interested in. These are the words, these are the most common words that appear in sentences which use sapo in the sense of LACEA sapo. So, guerrilla. So we'll come back to that. So obviously sapo is connected to shut up, don't give information, don't tell on anything. So it is connected to the conflict in Colombia. So that's going to be a thing as we're going to see. Authority is connected to authority. If you inform the authorities, you're a sapo. My favorite here is good barranquillero. Good barranquillero. There's a great story about the mayor of Barranquilla, who said, I have this information about people who committed murders, but I can't tell anyone because then I'd be a sapo. So a good barranquillero. Many things are connected to school, in fact. So here we have young people, teacher, child, school. There's a lot of examples of, children learning not to tell on their classmates because then they'd be sapos. So that's kind of interesting. And then, you see other stuff here about, there's the captured Medellin cartel, so it's connected to the whole kind of narco economy, or narco whatever it is, phenomenon. Okay, so just to give you some sense of like how this appears in the media and what connection. All right, so just to kind of preview of the results, as I said, we're going to try to look at I'm going to jump straight into the research design after this, but just to give you a sense of where we're going, we're going to try to show the extent to which allowing players in a game to kind of evoke this norm or accuse somebody of being a sapo influences equilibrium play in this basically fair Fishbacker model where third parties can enforce sort of pro-sociality. Okay, and the first and kind of probably the most interesting result in the whole paper is we're going to show that completely unravels, once I introduce this LACEA sapo into the game, it completely unravels the positive effect of third-party enforcement. Okay, so you basically go back to the dictator game without third-party enforcement. So I think that's probably the main thing. We're going to do that with we were worried that this LACEA sapo is too Colombian or something, and then everyone's going to say, well, who cares about that? It's about Colombia, So, and also we were a little worried it was a bit sort of strong, So what we actually use is something a little milder, which is sort of mind your own business, which would be a kind of, maybe it's a sort of synonym for LACEA sapo, but it's a little milder. And I guess we thought that might be interesting because there might be more external validity, or you might be able to think about it in different contexts, whereas, if you said LACEA sapo in England, nobody had any idea what you were talking about. So that's, I don't know if that's how we did it, yeah. So, okay, and as I said, it's going to lead to actual expected and pro-social behavior and social sanctioning, okay? Then what we did a lot of is trying to investigate the way people think about this. So we collected information on what do people think is appropriate, and in particular, a sort of incentivized way of getting people to kind of guess what do people generally think is appropriate, okay? So we were trying to understand the normative part of this, okay? So what's very interesting, and I think what's sort of deeply puzzling at some level, is that the majority of people expect to be called sapos. So they think people are going to call other people sapos. Nevertheless, 80% of Colombians, or people in the game, think that it's inappropriate to call people sapos. So they think it's inappropriate to call people sapos, but they still think they're going to be accused of being a sapo if they intervene. So it's not like there's some definitions of social norm which say everybody has to kind of normatively buy into this behavior. But that doesn't seem to be true in Colombia. Nevertheless, they expect it to occur in equilibrium. So I think that's that's what I find kind of puzzling and interesting. And, you know, and I'm not sure I know how to write down a model of it with social preferences, but anyway, it's interesting. We think it's interesting. Okay, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the evidence we have linking the incidence of this SAPO to history of violence experience, especially from the 1950s, from people's grandparents. But let me talk about the basic results to start with, and I'll talk more about some of the history. Okay, so here's the model. You know, this is, again, we tried to stick very close to the Fair and Fischbacher paper. So there's going to be a sender. A sender gets, you know, some endowment, which is about $6 US, unless there's been a depreciation of the peso during the seminar. It's about $6, was $6, and it's just like a dictator game. So the sender has to divide the money between themselves and a recipient. So the recipient just basically has no endowment. They sit there and they get the transfer from the dictator. And then there's a third player. So the third player has 50 experimental tokens. They observe the sender's decision, and they can basically intervene at a cost to reduce the payoff of the sender. Okay, so if they spend if they expend 1 token, they reduce the payoff of the sender by 3. So this is very close to the design of Fair and Fischbacher, which we thought was the kind of appealing way to do it. Okay, and so we're going to do 3 sort of versions of this. We're going to have the standard dictator game, where the third party just sort of sits there without doing anything. So you think that's like they're going to be the kind of baseline. Then we introduce the third party punishment as described. So the third party can now intervene to reduce the payoff of the sender. And then we're going to do one extra thing, which is just allow the sender, if punished, to respond by saying, you know, don't be a sapo. Okay, well, the mild version of it, right? So that doesn't cost the sender anything, and it doesn't reduce the payoff of the third party either. Okay, so but what we're going to see is just adding that move into the game in some sense deters the third party from intervening, because you anticipate that if you punish, then you run the risk of being called a sapo. Okay, and that's, as I say, that's hard to model, but anyway, okay, so that's the idea. So we did this with 408 students. We're still running more. You'll see at the end why we're doing more rounds. But you know, this is at the University of the Andes, and that's what we do. And the way it goes is, you know, we get some students. People are divided into sender, receiver, third party. They play 5 rounds of this game, so their identity stays the same, but after every round, they're randomly matched with somebody else, okay? So they don't know anyone's identity, so it's completely anonymous, and all you know is sort of what happened in your play of the game in the last round, okay? So here's the basic result, okay, which comes out of that. I might show you the histogram. I'm not going to be able to show you the histogram. The histogram's rather nice, actually. But anyway, this is fine. So the left column here is just the basic dictator game. So that gives you the cent amount, which is, you know, about 25. It's like a quarter of the endowment in the basic dictator game. The second treatment, and this is just the first. We do 5 rounds, but this is just the first round. So when we did this, we wanted to do it in a way to make it as comparable as possible with the Fair and Fischbacher paper. So they have a sort of static model. So we're just looking at the first round. And when you did the first round, you didn't know that the game was going to continue. Okay, so this is the first round. So then you find this, you know, classic sort of Fair and Fischbacher effect, which, you know, my sense is that there's people in this audience who know this literature much better than me, but this seems very robust, this finding, that introducing this third party increases the prosociality. Okay, so once you introduce a third party, the sender understands that they're going to be punished for being, you know, not sufficiently prosocial, and in response they send more. Okay, and that's what you see there. And the dark gray, the right, is what happens when I introduce the message. Okay, so now I introduce the message, meaning it's exactly the same, except the sender, if punished, can basically say, you know, don't be a sapo. All right? So now, you know, backward induction, and I'll show you you know, in a second. Now the third party kind of understands that if they punish, they risk being called a sapo, they're going to punish less, I'm going to show you, and then in response, the sender's going to send less, okay? And in fact, you can see it basically kind of unravels back to the situation when there was no third party whatsoever, you know. So I think this is the main result, okay? So one thing we were interested to do is sort of think through, like, so that story I just told you involves the third party anticipating being called a sapo. It's Colombia, so they don't like being called a sapo, okay? So they'd like to avoid that, and in response, they punish less, okay? So we elicited this information on punishment using the sort of strategy method, and the way we did it was to sort of get people to say, get third parties to say, you know, how much would they punish a sender as a function of how much the sender sent, okay? So here are the kind of bins from 0 up to 50, and the way we did it was you do this with the strategy method, and then you play the game, and you're sort of committed to punish whatever you said. So if you lay out how much you're going to punish depending on what the sender says, if you say, you know, if the sender sends 20, I'm going to spend 3 tokens to reduce the payoff, then you actually have to do that, okay? So it's sort of incentive compatible. That's the idea. You're committed to it. And you can see here, so just comparing the light bars is the third party game, and then the darker bars is the with the message. You can see almost uniformly introducing the message reduces people's willingness to punish, okay? So this is kind of trying to underpin this backward induction story I gave you. Once you anticipate that you're going to be called a sapo, then you're going to be much more hesitant to punish. What does that mean? You know, it means you reduce the amount you punish, thinking that that's going to reduce the probability of being accused of being a sapo. Okay, so that's the histogram is very nice, but anyway, so that's the thing. All right, and now we were very interested in how do people think about this situation, okay? Do people think that the sapo norm is a sort of appropriate way to behave or not? Okay, so we used a bunch of kind of very standard techniques to try to elicit what people think of as being socially appropriate. So let me try to talk through that because I think that generates this puzzle, which is despite people thinking that sapo, they're going to be accused of being a sapo, collectively, people don't think this is appropriate, okay? So people recognize it's not appropriate. I guess you could say that's a good thing, because it means that there's actually much more scope maybe for changing the equilibrium than if people thought it was appropriate. So, okay, so let me first, before I get into that, let me just give you some, we also asked people about, you know, we asked recipients, like, do you expect, we asked them about their sort of empirical expectations, which is just about your expectations about the use of sapo, okay? So meaning, you know, if you, and we do this just like round one, I guess I'm sort of focusing a lot on round one for the reason I talked about, but, you know, we could also look at it across all rounds. And what this first, what the first figure on the left, the figure A, shows you is that about 50% of recipients basically expected senders who were punished to use this to accuse the punisher of being a sapo. Okay, so 50%, and of course, looking across all rounds, we collect this information after every round that actually goes up to 70%. Okay, so you know, of course, in that over time, you actually, in some circumstances, you observe people being called a sapo. So that actually increases your belief that people are going to call sapo. So maybe the first round is more interesting as a statement about what Colombians believe before they start playing the game. So 50% believe that a sender who is punished is going to be accused of being a sapo. On the right, look at that, beautiful. On the right, we actually just have the data on the extent to which punished senders accused the third party of being a sapo. So in the first round, it's about, it's close to 15%, and then it goes up over time to about a third of people. So about a third of people who were punished sent the message of don't be a sapo, essentially. Okay, so this is just, and we didn't do this, you could ask, well, why don't we ask the third party what they expect? But we were kind of concerned about sort of experimental demand effect. The third party is going to be the one actually punishing, so we didn't want to somehow seem to be suggesting anything. So that's why we just did this with the recipient rather than recipient and the third party. Okay, but when we get into the sort of normative thing, this is where I think it gets really interesting. So we asked people, do you think, so trying to get them to guess what people playing this game believe. So do you believe it's appropriate for the sender to give less than 50%, let's say? So think of 50% as being, somehow the fair thing to do, or the most pro-social thing to do. Do you think it's appropriate for somebody to give less than 50%? So we have this scale, where very appropriate, we have these kind of broad bins, and then you get money if you guess, in some sense, what the average is, or what a randomly chosen person guesses. So you're incentivized to guess what the average person sort of believes, to try to capture the sort of social expectations. So the first two, so this is looking at the receiver and the third party. So we do this like right at the end, basically. So you remember, the students come, they play this game 5 times, and at the end, we elicit this information, okay? So the first two columns here sort of show you for the receiver and the third party that about 60% of people think that it's appropriate to give 50-50. Okay, so it's actually only 40%, less than half, think it's fine to give less than 50. Okay, so being fair is what's most socially acceptable. That's what we find. The second column, this is a bit too high tech for me, but Jose made the slides, so most of them. Okay, he made these ones. This is way too technical for me. So, okay, so second one is, do you think it's appropriate to sanction someone who behaves non-pro-socially? Okay, so here you see a whacking 80% of people think that it's okay to punish someone who's not pro-social. Okay, so, and then the third one is about sapo. Do you think it's appropriate to call somebody a sapo if they punish you for being non-pro-social? And only 20% of people say yes. So 80% of people, so what's interesting about this is, 80% of people think it's actually appropriate, or they think it's not just their own opinion. I'm saying it wrong. It's not their own opinion. It's what society thinks, or what's socially appropriate. So 80% of people think that it's socially appropriate. Colombians believe it's socially appropriate to punish non-pro-social people, and only 20% think it's appropriate. I'm not saying this right, but you know what I mean. Only 20% of people, their conjecture, which is correct about Colombians' notions of appropriate, is only 20% of people think that it's appropriate to call people a sapo. Nevertheless, remember, 50% of receivers think that people will be accused of being a sapo. So this is, this is a puzzle. I think this is a puzzle. Like, for me, it's a puzzle. So it's hard to, I'm going to show you some evidence that this sapo norm is extremely persistent in Colombia. But the equilibrium is kind of odd, So I guess one of the big agendas here is trying to understand, to the extent that one has these antisocial norms kind of in equilibrium influencing resource allocation or behavior, how does that equilibrium work? How does it hang together? So I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I'm just sort of describing what we find, so that's okay. All right. So enough of that. Okay. So here's the I think I summarized everything. Let me jump to. So I think I told you the main results. I kind of end there with a puzzle of how this equilibrium hangs together. But now let me talk a little bit about how the Colombians got into this mess. Okay. So the roots seem to be clearly from Spain. So what we've been doing is sort of searching for this through lots of different sources, Spanish literature sources, Latin American newspapers, etc. There's some very interesting Spanish antecedents, I think, which, to my knowledge, have not been well researched, but which are pretty suggestive. One is, which comes up all the time, is this, I obey, but I do not put into effect. Or, so this is this adage that comes up all the time in history books about Latin America. I can't find anything good on it. So if anyone knows a good citation on where this has been researched, but it's this idea of sort of like, it's okay to kind of ignore you. It's okay to break the rules or ignore the rules, Obedezco pero no cumplo, okay? It's actually, the roots of that are sort of interesting. This is Thompson's book on Castile, but the roots of it, at least according to the historians who I can find discussing it, is actually connected to the rise of absolutism in Spain and the kind of deterioration of representative institutions and a kind of equilibrium whereby people in society started appealing to kind of natural law. We don't have any representative institutions to keep the king under control, but there are these principles which are more powerful than the law and the king, like natural law, you would have called it, okay? So then this idea of, so here's Thompson talking about this, the legality was to be defended even against the intervention of the king himself, and the king's orders would be to wade against external standards of justice and public policy. So but obviously this translated into, this transferred itself to Latin America, and it ended up meaning something rather different from that. Okay, so that's that's one sort of obvious precursor to all of this. I also think, one of my friends, he was telling, the picaresque novel, this is not something that you have too much in English, but this idea of a picaro, again, going back to 16th century Spain, La Vida de Lazarillo de Tormes is like the first picaresque novel, and the hero, is somebody who basically gets by on his wits by cheating the system, by cheating everybody. And here this is a famous moment in the book, this is the blind man, this is like his blind beggar who's this is Lazarillo here on the left, the blind beggar is sort of looking after him, and here he's stealing his wine. You see, he's got this straw, and he's stealing his wine. So the whole book, he's a kind of rogue, he's a heroic rogue who sort of cheats the system, and, there's this notion of the picaresque novel. There's actually some real data on rule. This is from work by Michel Gelfand, who's a social psychologist at Stanford Business School. And it's hard to see this, but this is on a scale of 1 to 6. In this country, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, others will strongly disagree. Okay, so this is sort of like what we're talking about. If you doing something inappropriate, see why, So here's, these are wanted posters, do you want to be another victim of black blood? Sangre Negra was a sort of liberal gangster, and y su cuadrilla de malhechores, what's that? Bad boys, his cuadrilla, like his gang of bad boys, okay? Do you want to be another victim? And then it's like, denounce them to the authorities. Okay, so during the 1950s, Colombia, there was a civil war in Colombia. There were lots of these kind of warlords running about, and the government tried to get you to denounce them. Okay, and what's interesting about this, of course, is that now, if you're sangre negra, you need people to shut up. You don't want people to denounce you to the authorities. Okay, so there's a very famous book which was commissioned at the end of the war in 1958, to study the origins of La Violencia, edited by Guzman Campos and Fals Borda, and this is where we found the sort of connection to the violence. So so it's talking here about there's a new language comes, the language of the Violencia, and here on the right you have sapea or sapo, which is sort of the equivalent of betrayed or informer. Okay, so sapo and sapea becomes associated. It's what they call this new language of the violence, and this is just from Guzman Campo and Fals Borda, which is associated with betrayal. You're a betrayer. You're a sapo. You're an informer. You're a sapo. And then just down here, this sort of it says it passes into a general use in Colombia. So this is one of the words that they point out kind of jumps from the context of the conflict in Colombia in the 1950s into the language. So by the time you get to the 1970s, this is all over kind of popular culture in Colombia. It spreads, it sort of persists. But this seems to be again, you can find much more ancient uses of the word, but this seems to be where it kind of takes off according to what we found. So then we thought, okay, so we should be able to study this. So the hypothesis here would be, if we could construct family histories of the participants in our game, then we can ask questions about, to what extent your grandparents impacted by La Violencia, were they displaced? That's a little difficult, to do, to collect that information. And a simpler thing is, to ask if they were, which Colombians turn out to remember better, is, were they liberals? So it used to be in Colombia, you had these two parties called the liberals and conservatives, and everyone was either a liberal or you were a conservative, and your family were liberals or your family were conservative. I don't think that's true anymore, but it used to be true. So we asked about whether your grandparents were liberals. There's different ways we could do this. We're still playing with it. We also asked about where were your grandparents living. So there's very good data on the incidence of La Violencia, like where conflicts were and stuff. So if we knew where their grandparents were living in 1950 or whatever, then we could also use that. We're still building that as a kind of independent measure of how likely was it that you were impacted by La Violencia. So here's the here's the result. So that's the hypothesis. Is just so this is more preliminary than the first thing is so. We construct retrospectively these different ways of measuring the impact of La Violencia on your family, and then we look at how that affects the way you play the game. Okay, and we're very underpowered here because this incomplete. People don't. It's hard to. First of all, we only thought about this after we ran the first round. So we're running more rounds now. Hindsight is a marvelous thing, my mother used to say. So we're running more rounds now, so we'll have more data in the future. So to think about this as just kind of a little bit of evidence and where we're going, okay? So let me just go through some of these. So La Violencia exposure, so I'm just going to show you kind of there's lots of ways of measuring that, as I said. I'm going to show you two things. So odd columns use just a question about were your parents impacted by La Violencia? So we have more detailed information about how they were impacted, but that's just like a dummy variable, yes, no. And the second, that's the odd columns, and the even columns use just this: were your grandparents liberals? Okay, so for the Violencia was really most of the violence was perpetrated by the conservative. Now I'm going to get myself into trouble. Was perpetrated by the conservative government and kind of militarized arms of the conservative government. And if you were a liberal, you'd say people like Sangre Negra were just they were just like self-defense forces. Anyway, so the even columns are just looking at this. Was your grandparent a liberal? So that's a way of trying to proxy for were they likely to be victimized in La Violencia. So in the first part here, the first four columns, La Violencia exposure is like the sender. Okay, so think about in this game, when people are playing the game, nobody knows. I don't know whether your grandparent was a liberal or whether they were impacted by la violencia. So nobody knows that. We know it, but the participants of the game don't know it. But we're interested in just whether that history, that family history, impacts the way you play. Okay, so here, now I look at, I'm just modeling like the amount sent. So this is the sender, the amount sent. Okay, how is that impacted by the exposure of the sender to la violencia? Okay, so what you see here is kind of interesting. This is a result that pops up quite a lot in this literature, which is that, other things equal, a history of exposure to la violencia makes you more pro-social. Okay, so this means, you know, senders who had exposure to la violencia actually send more to start with. But what's fascinating is when you interact it with, that's, you know, when I interact it with the kind of third-party game with the message, that's negative and it completely wipes out the positive effect here. Okay, so here it seems to be that, you know, that just looking at the amount sent, having a history of la violencia in the family, it actually removes this positive effect of, you know, like there's some people like Joe Henrich. Joe is a big believer in this idea that conflict, you know, is what made us humans, and conflict forced us to be kind of more cooperative and more pro-social and stuff like that. So, but this is kind of the opposite of what we find here. We find there's some sort of direct effect of pro-sociality, but it's completely wiped out in this, you know, because the legacy of la violencia wipes out this third-party mechanism, in some sense, you know. Okay, and then you might be interested, again, we're super underpowered to do this, but you might be interested in, you know, does a history of exposure to la violencia kind of make you more inclined to send the Sapo message? Okay, so that's what 3 and 4, that's what 3 and 4, that's what 3 and 4 look at, and you know, we're very underpowered. We're working on that. There's a little bit of evidence there, but I don't want to sell that too hard. Okay? And then at the end, we look at the third party, you know, so the third party, this is a bit more complicated to think through, but what's the impact of a exposure to la violencia on the third party? Okay, so in the first 4 columns, we're thinking about the exposure to la violencia of the sender, and now we're thinking of the third party, and I guess that, you know, the result, which is sort of interesting, is at least in one specification where we have this liberal, the grandparent was a liberal, you know, you find there's some tendency to kind of maybe punish more, but again, an experience of la violencia kind of wipes that out. Okay, so this is just, you know, this is some tentative evidence that maybe it's plausible in Colombia to think that the violence or the extent of the violence shaped people's social norms. You know, this norm certainly seems to have propagated itself in the 1950s, and then it kind of embeds itself in society. And I guess there's some evidence here that history at a kind of micro level, I mean, I was kind of surprised that anything was going to work here. So there's some evidence here to be worked on that at the micro level, a kind of family history of this actually helps explain your sensitivity to these incentives or the way you play the game. All right, I think that's more or less all I have to say. I'm happy to, we have 10 minutes for questions. Yeah. Okay. I don't know how we organize that. Says, oh, you must have thought this through by backward induction.
Hi, this is a very, it's really a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. Just maybe a comment about the experiment. It might be useful in your experiment. The norm you're looking, the norm that you establish or that you find with the Krupke-Weber protocol is an injunctive norm. It's about what you should do. maybe you could try to do the same procedure. You're still gathering data, so you might try to do the same procedure with a descriptive norm, which is what people actually do. And so, you can ask people, what would you do in this situation? And then incentivize people to say, what percentage of people do you think acted this way, responded that way in the first question? So you could look at the tension between the descriptive and the injunctive norms, which is really a big contrast here. That's really interesting. Another possibility would be to look at the last period data. You look at the first period data, which is very interesting, but you might be worried to call someone a sapo because it's a repeated interaction, and so the person punching might be worried about being called a sapo.
Yeah.
Is what I mean to say, and so that might make people reluctant to punish. But if you look at you're reluctant to call someone a sapo because in the next round, you might get punished if you call that person a sapo.
Yeah.
And so in the very last period, in the last move, the last thing someone does, the last move is to call someone a sapo, the person who punished you. And so that might be actually a true reflection of what people really feel, because they're not worried about subsequently being punished. They'll just kind of let loose and call the person a sapo then in the last period. So I guess they'd have to know they're playing in the last round at that point.
I mean, I think, so the first point is that's very well taken. We should think about that more. I think on the second point, there is this literature about sort of retaliation, and if I punish and somebody else can punish me for punishing. So I think we were trying to sort of stay clear of that, or to try to sort of distinguish cleanly what we were doing from that literature. But it could be that there's ways of looking at that are
it's just that the very last move overall in the whole session is free of retaliation.
Yeah, okay.
So that's an interesting one to look at, and I think in your setting, it's the last chance you get to call the punisher a sapo is free of the possibility of retaliation.
Okay, I see what you mean, yeah.
So I agree, it's very interesting. It's the first time I see you presenting, but I've seen the paper before. My question is, given that you are running more rounds, you might want to add another message, because you have only one message. So you have mind your own business or no message. So that can bias what people will, like the number of people that believes that they are going to use the message, that's the only action they have. So you might want to add either a neutral message or sort of a positive message saying like, sorry, my bad. And that might decrease the amount of, the expectation of the sender or the recipient, I forgot, of people using the no sea sapo message. It's sort of some people might think that it's an experimental demand effect, because that's the only action that's possible for them.
Yeah, we could think about that, yeah.
I have a question back here. Yeah. So a couple comments. Thank you so much. The first is just building off of the idea of injunctive norms and what have you. In that you also had it as well in terms of talking about the king, the Castilian king in the 14th century, et cetera. And then it was in your data. People know or we'll say in Latin America, people know what's right and wrong, right? The other thing is, or if you were to ask them, right? But the other thing is to say, are you going to tell the authority, right? And I think when you get into that area, it's a question of, do you trust that authority? Right, and just in general trust of what were possible repercussions, and I'm thinking about that of violencia, et cetera. So that's one comment. The other is you call it an antisocial norm, and I'm not so sure if that's maybe the right way to say it, because I think you had the word cloud, right, of the paper. And being from the U.S. and having a daughter who's growing up in Latin America, it's fascinating to see her in school because she won't tell on anybody, right? Whereas in your U.S., you're just you're going to tell, right? And so I asked her, and she says, no. She goes, that would be betraying my group, right? So there's a certain type of horizontal pro-sociality that's at play that then when you combine that with kind of a lack of a trust in authority, right? It seems to be there's other kind of elements. So I wonder if maybe there's other things you could look at in terms of trust and authority, or measuring the strength of kind of a horizontal pro-social norm that may be being invoked. Just a couple things to look at.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we were very interested in, kind of eliciting these, how people think about what's appropriate and how sort of the people playing the game collectively think about this. I think that kind of rules out this idea that, we have some group solidarity or, and so we need to foster that solidarity. And so somebody who kind of rats somebody out is that's actually not antisocial. You're kind of supporting the group. But I think it's difficult to interpret the data like that because it's so overwhelming that people think this SAPO is like inappropriate and pro-sociality is appropriate and punishing antisocial people is appropriate. Calling people a SAPO is not appropriate, but nevertheless, I think 50% of people are going to call somebody a SAPO. So I think, I get your point, but I think it's hard to kind of interpret the data like that, I would say. Yeah. Who's in charge?
Thank you. So Jim, thanks, that's fascinating. This last thing you talked about, and you mentioned before as well, so it seems to be like a puzzle that you know it's wrong, or you think it's wrong to call people sapos, but you expect to be called a sapo. Isn't that just like, knowing there are two equilibria? You sort of know there is a good equilibrium out there, but you also know you're not in it. It's like, okay, the right thing to do would be that, and perhaps we could be in that equilibrium, but we're not in that equilibrium. We're in an equilibrium where everybody cheats, and so I fully expect you to cheat. Now, it's not that I think it's right. I know it's wrong. I just know that we're in this equilibrium.
I'm not sure if that's the right way to think about it. I think, if you were thinking about having a model where you had some sort of social preferences and, if you call me a sapo, that gives me some disutility. I don't like being called a sapo. But you'd think that disutility would be a function of, how people in society thought about it. Why would I get disutility if I thought 80% of people think it's inappropriate to use that sapo? I shouldn't. That's why I say I find it hard to think about what a model looks like. I mean, I don't know if it's a model of, I guess, I don't know, I'd have to think about how to interpret what people are saying. You're kind of saying people it might be sort of aspirational or something, and there's some equilibrium where we're playing the sapo, and when we elicit these normative beliefs that's somehow describing a different world, or a different situation than we're actually in. I guess that's not the way I'm thinking about it at the moment, but I could think more about that. Yeah, I don't know if there's ways of trying to articulate that hypothesis kind of in a cleaner way. Yeah.
Hello. I wanted to ask you a question about whether you would be interested in measuring cultural capital and how much the participants would be willing to self-advocate if they were put in a tricky situation where they needed to interact with a figure of authority or secure a right that was being violated in some other way. And the second thing I was wondering if, since you're working with a student population, it might be worth controlling for whether they have a history of bullying or whether there's some sort of channel through early childhood of, the use of the word.
I'm finding it really hard to hear. Sorry, there's an echo. Can you ask me again? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I had two components to the question. So the first is if you have measures of cultural capital that you might measure, such as willing to advocate if your rights are being violated in some way, or if you're interacting with a figure of authority, or how you feel about your classmates, or if you're willing to interact with them in some other way, maybe some other domain. And then the second component is, since you're working with a student population, if you would control for a history of bullying, since maybe that's the first appearance of that wording or that sentence in a lot of Colombians.
No, I mean we have socioeconomic covariates, we have stuff. I'm not sure we have anything like what you're describing as sort of some measure of social capital. I mean, I know, like, so I didn't really talk about that, because we're still working on it. We have a kind of problem of power. But, for example, if you look at the microdata on, so some people, 20% of people say, they think it's, they think that, it's okay to call somebody a sapo. So if you look at that, that predicts sending the message, but I don't know if that's like regressing X on X, but so we can say some things at that micro level, but I don't think we have most of what you're asking for.
Could you collect it in some type of baseline survey for the next rounds?
I'd have to go and, I'm not sure. We're not using it. I don't know. I'd have to check.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
I'd have to check. Yeah.
One last question. From Colombia.
Yeah, but it's not about Colombia, actually. So thinking about external validity and also how you think about the origin of this, it comes to my mind that there's also, like, in the Sicilian mafia, inventor word that is omerta, which is essentially the code of silence, right? So they didn't have, or they actually did have some Spain heritage, but it's probably not coming from there, but from this sort of mafia kind of environment, which is also present in Colombia, right? So it's probably, you don't have to go all the way down to Spain to think about the origin of this code of silence, which is also very similar to what happens in the south of Italy. So it's just,
so I mean, Diego Gambetta has a book about that, for example. I think that's right, and obviously that's part of it. Like there's quite a few quotes from Pablo Escobar in El Tiempo about sapos and things like that. But I think the reason I told the story about the taxi driver in Armenia is that that's not about narcos or whatever, that's just some kind of ordinary, and if you look on YouTube, I was going to show one, but there's so many like expletives that I decided not to show it, but there's plenty of videos on YouTube of people calling other people sapo, just like, you park your car, you block the street, you park your car in a place you shouldn't park the car, someone comes along and the guy calls you, sapo, just piss off, sapo kind of thing. So I just think in that, I think you're right, obviously, but I guess, it seems to be much more prevalent than that in society. It's not just restricted to the kind of underworld, I would say. Maybe that's where it started, or it started in La Violencia, but then it sort of spread out, like Guzman Campos said, it spreads out into society much more generally. Yeah, I think that's what's more, I don't quite understand how that diffusion takes place or why it gets traction, but it seems to have done, yeah. Okay. You're right.